So the other aspect is the national debt, right?
Hmm.
So the national debt is essentially every time we run a deficit, the Treasury is required to issue bonds to finance. I'm going to use quote fingers when I say that, to finance the deficit. So they issue bonds and they sell these bonds. And who do they sell these to? But currency users. Only people who hold and use the US currency and have it can purchase US Treasury bonds. You have to do it with US currency. Now, you could get your currency exchanged for dollars and buy a bond. That's not a problem at all. So you have to pay for the bond with US dollars. And then when you get that bond, that is a it's a savings instrument, right? It's interest bearing. So you'll pay a certain amount, and then a certain in a few years you will be able to cash it in, and you'll get that money back plus interest. But you're always going to get it in dollars. You paid for it in dollars, you'll get it in dollars. So the national debt, the government never has a problem paying its debt. Why? Because it issues the currency. It can always make good on the debt. So if you were to buy a bond today and cash it in 7 years from now, they will just give you what it is plus interest. Now, a lot of people worry about how are we going to pay the interest on the national debt? Well, that's not a problem for the currency issuer. It's the currency issuer's debt. And because they can just like you and I, we don't have a printing press. We can't just pay our debts by just having a printing press and giving money and getting out of our debts. The currency issuer can actually do that as long as the debt is denominated in its own currency. It can never go insolvent. It can always pay its debt. So, and then looking at the national debt as well, what's the other side of the balance sheet on the national debt? Well, if I purchased a bond and that's a savings instrument for me, I have securities in my 401k, or I have securities or bonds, what we know as bonds in our my 401k or in my IRA. That's my savings. So essentially, when you look at the national debt, yes, you are looking at the currency issuer's debt, a debt that that currency issuer can always pay because they issue the currency. However, what you're also looking at is you're looking at the currency user's savings account, a currency user savings account. So that big, scary debt clock that we're all supposed to be afraid of, and we believe that one day there's going to be a big tax payment that we have due. I think right now it's at $60,000 per person on the debt clock. That's never going to happen because that is the currency issuer's debt, and they'll always be able to pay it. The currency users, that's our savings. Those are bonds that we purchase as currency users. And so that's good for us. That
Not
allows
not everybody's purchased these bonds,
no,
right?
not everybody purchase them, but most people who have savings, most people who have retirement accounts, because retirement accounts are diversified. There's very various different things that people will invest in. And one of the things they almost always invest in are treasuries. And the reason why they almost always invest in treasuries is because it's one of the most sound investments. Because guess what? The federal government can always make good on its debt. So essentially, the debt and then the deficit and the national debt are just not what they're made out to be. They're made out to be these big, scary things. But when you realize it and you look at through the balance sheet, you realize the deficit is surplus money for currency users, and the national debt is actually a savings account for currency users. And of course, it's only the people that hold the bonds, but it's not this really scary thing that we tend to fret about. As a matter of fact, today I just I was reading a poll that was taken, a Gallup poll about what Americans are most concerned about. And the top thing was healthcare, which not surprisingly, but number three was the deficit in government spending.
Hmm.
So people do really worry about this and really think that there's going to be a big tax payment. And we do at some point. And if it's not us, it's going to be our kids or our grandkids. And that's simply just not the case because as the currency issuer's debt, it can always make good on it as long as it's denominated in US dollars.
Do you think that this principle is partly in reason why our military spending or our defense spending continues to
Bro.
continues to increase
Yeah, yeah.
because they know that, regardless of how much they spend on that, that it's really not an issue that we'll ever really have to worry about.
Well, from what I understand, Dick Cheney said, and I guess I don't know if I guess Reagan had said this at some point, that deficits don't really matter.
Yes.
Now, what he may mean is we've never been able to get to a deficit that's ever caused a horrible crash in the economy, or we've never gotten the the debt to a point where something horrible has happened. So maybe this, military spending is not a big deal at all. Or maybe there are actually people that do understand. It's really hard to say, but based on how a lot of politicians behave, it seems as though they just understand less. They don't know, but they just know, well, it's not causing any problems. It doesn't have running a deficit isn't really causing any massive problems that we've been able to point to.
Well, it seems like they do understand that it's not really problematic
Yeah.
because during the campaign season, they say we have to balance the budget, or at least the federal. We have to balance the budget and things like that. But then when they actually go and do tax cuts and increasing military spending, they just like, oh yeah, by the way, guys, the deficit doesn't really matter. And
Well,
you
yeah,
start
and
hearing
also
that. Like I think Mitch McConnell said this a few months, like maybe a few months ago, that the
that the
deficit isn't really a big deal.
right, right. And but the thing is, do they understand MMT, or do they just kind of know that there doesn't seem to be any consequences that are coming from running a deficit or the
Right.
national debt getting any bigger? And as we know, they tend to want to spend on military, and they tend to want to cut taxes because it's also their way of then running up the deficit and then saying, oh no, looks like we'll have to cut spending on entitlement programs. This is
Right.
how they do their death by a thousand cuts, right? That's how they kind of try to get in there and slash things like Social Security, just little bits at a time, so nobody really ever notices it until it's all gone. So this seems to be part of their tactic. And if you haven't noticed, um, once a few months after maybe it was probably a month after, or maybe even less than that, that the Trump's tax cuts went into place, all of
Mhm.
a sudden people were like, "Oh no, you know, inflation's coming, inflation." So they use inflation as a very scary word, and we haven't seen a big rise in inflation starting. But they were saying, "Oh no, oh no." Now the whole thing is the national debt. They're talking more and more about the national debt because this is very helpful when they want to have to turn around and go, "Look, we've got to tighten our purse strings. We've got to be responsible. Guess we're going to have to do some cuts to some programs people really like. Just being responsible." But they're never going to cut the military. And, the tax breaks were good. They were good for us. And some people probably are seeing some money coming back, but it doesn't seem to be a lot for average people in comparison to what is the big, huge amounts that are going to the top.
Just how evil are these people then?
That's a really good question. You know, it's ideology. It's just their ideology, but we also know, Janet, that it's this sorry about
Well, I mean, it's ideology, it's ideological base, but it's also a way, at least from my point of view, to penalize people for being poor. Because
that. Oh, absolutely.
really, there's no other crime in America that's worse than being poor.
Yep.
And everybody's under this impression that if I work hard enough, then I can, finally be a millionaire. Well, not everybody can be a millionaire. We need workers, but they have to have that idea to continue being workers and to continue the status quo as it is. Otherwise, people would be pissed, right? And I think there is a lot of anger in the country brewing, if not already taking form. So it's really a great way to penalize people for being poor. But
Yeah,
you have
absolutely.
something else to add to that,
And
Kathleen.
they turn that into a moral thing. That's like a moral crusade for them. The poor have to learn to be more moral. If they
Right.
if they were more moral, they would have money and they wouldn't get into this situation. And that's a lot of the kind of talk that we get whenever a lot of what we hear from Republicans, that tends to be their line much more than the Democrats. But Democrats sort of go along with these things as well, because the other problem is it that they're evil, or is that they're doing the bidding of their donors? Because obviously this goes in favor of their donors, and that's also why Democrats play this game with how are you going to pay for it and stuff like that. They also they don't go quite so far to be like, let's go cutting up those entitlements. They don't go there that far like the Republicans do. Let's start cutting those to shreds. But they do this thing where we can't have Medicare for all, because how are you going to pay for it? We literally had Hillary Clinton saying you're never ever 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 going to, it's never going to happen. Medicare for all is never going to happen. And her whole thing is, when she wrote her book, saying, Bernie was saying, these are ponies. You can't have these things. It's impossible. When actually, if you understand MMT, not only do you know it's possible, but you actually realize that Medicare for all, because it will actually cut spending, it will reduce spending in the economy. If we continue on with our system right now, over the next 10 years, it's going to cost us $49 trillion. But if we go to Medicare for all, say we start tomorrow on Medicare for all, over the next 10 years, it will cost us, I think, $32 trillion. So that's $17 trillion that's not going to be spent into the economy. And what does that actually mean from an MMT perspective? That means it's deflationary. And if it's deflationary, then you probably don't want to tax people for Medicare. We don't want to add an additional tax, because there's already going to be less spending in the economy. People will definitely lose their job, because we're probably going to shrink the private insurance industry at the very least. So people will lose those jobs, and on top of it, healthcare is just not going to cost as much. So there's not going to be more money coming out of our pockets spending on that. So jobs will likely be lost in certain areas. So what should the government do in that situation? The government should be worried about balancing the economy, which is where we get to the last bit of this, is that at the federal level, it shouldn't be about balancing a budget. The currency issuer doesn't need to worry about that. What the currency issuer needs to worry about is balancing the economy as a whole. So essentially, the federal government has a very real job in our economy. We've been told for years and years and years that the government should stay out of the economy, but it has a very real, very vital, important job, and that is to help balance it out, because we can't depend on the market to balance itself out, when bad times hit and when people are unemployed. Um, so in a deflationary situation, like they were to put in Medicare for all, and we don't know exactly, I'm sure they'd have to run models to see how deflationary and how you'd counteract that. Would you put in a spending program? Would you just not? Would you definitely not have a tax? I would probably guess that you probably wouldn't want to tax people if you're going for the first few years.
Well, the argument I think that I've seen for Medicare for all is that not only will it save money, but you can tax people more than what their healthcare costs now per year. So you're basically saying that in an MMT perspective, you wouldn't even really need that tax. Is that accurate?
You wouldn't need a tax.
Or
Yeah.
you wouldn't potentially need that tax?
You wouldn't potentially. It wouldn't be a matter of having to get the money to pay for it.
Okay.
Because if the federal government is focused on balancing the economy, it needs to realize, when we put this into place, yes, there'll be spending in order to set up Medicare for all, right? There's going to be a certain amount of money that's definitely going to be spent. But there's also, at the same time, once we eliminate all the private insurers and all the additional costs, because we do know that the private market makes it more expensive. So more people are spending into the economy for their health care. So that spending is going to be significantly less from the 32 trillion versus the 49 trillion. So there's a good chance that the government probably shouldn't tax anybody at all, any additional tax, at least in the beginning years when this is beginning to be set up, because there is going to be there's going to be job loss. There's going to be there's going to be less money being spent, because it's not just about the government spending money, it's about us spending money as well. When we dip into our savings and we spend it into the economy, that helps, create jobs, and that helps, build, allow people to go and start businesses and stuff like that. And if we're not needing to spend anymore, then there's going to be something missing out in the economy that the government should find a way to make up for, or and definitely probably not tax money away from us.
So one thing that I would just want to make note is that when you mention balancing the economy, it's a lot easier to think of balancing the budget because you only have basically two things that you really think about: debt and deficit. Whereas balancing the economy is more a three-dimensional idea.
It's big.
And it's yeah, so it's a lot harder for people to understand a balanced economy. So that being said, what goes into balancing an economy over what we kind of normally think of as balancing the budget?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. And as I told you earlier, the reason why I became interested in MMT was because I was always trying to figure out how did we do World War II? Like, how did this happen? How were
Mhm.
we able to spend so much money during that time and not have horrible things happen? Because we're told today that when you spend a lot of money, when the government spends a lot of money, horrible things are going to happen. So when you look at World War II, we went from 1940, we spent about I think it was 9 billion in 1940. That was how much the government spent in that year. And then during the war years, we had ratcheted up spending up to 98 billion a year on average during the war years. So that's an over 100% increase in spending. So the government was spending a massive amount into the economy in order to build the arsenal of democracy, right? That was the whole purpose of it. And um, that means that there's two things that were happening. So while we were shifting to this military production economy, right, we were having to reduce the consumer production economy. So that was already now beginning to make consumer goods more scarce in our economy. So the government had to take that into consideration. So there was actually a price control board that that was essentially in charge of really controlling inflation, because that is what the government needs to worry about when it spends into the economy. Is this a situation? Is the economy at a point where we have enough room in the economy where more people could be hired? We have enough resources that we're not going to create an inflationary situation. So in World War II, they had a sort of special situation that because the consumer economy had to be shrunk to some degree to make room for the consumer production had to make room for the military production. And you and we can't eat bullets, right? So we're going to have to get food, and they're sort of shrinking that part of the economy. So they did three things to balance the economy. And remember, this is wartime, so I'm going to bring up first, they did rationing. We all know about war rations. So you couldn't go out and you couldn't buy, 12 pounds of butter in a week. You could only buy a pound of butter in a week. So that was one way they kept prices from being driven up. And that was due in large part because that's what happens a lot during wars. You have to ration due to the conditions, but also, because typically in that type of situation, you're reducing the consumer production. So one thing they did, big thing, was the rationing. The second thing they did was they raised taxes. They needed to pull more money out of the economy. They had to make sure people didn't have too much money, that they were creating an inflationary situation. So they taxed it away from them. The last thing that big thing they did, was they issued war bonds. And during the war, almost $200 billion in war bonds were purchased. So about 2/3 of what was spent was purchased in war bonds. As we talked about before, bonds, though those bonds may represent the debt of the currency issuer, they are the savings of the people who bought them. So people were encouraged to take about 10% of their salary and buy war bonds with it. So a lot of people did do that. A lot of people ended up, not everybody, but a lot of people ended up purchasing war bonds during the war. They would have movie stars come out and have war bond rallies, and people would, you know, inspired to go and purchase them out of a sense of really patriotism, right? They thought they were funding the war. We're helping our boys away abroad, right?
Mhm.
And what they were really doing for themselves is they were creating savings with these war bonds, so that when the war ended, they tended to be about 10-year war bonds, so 10-year bonds. So they would buy them for about 75% of the price that they would be expected to get in 10 years, so for their maturity price. So they would pay $3 for a $4 war bond, and in 10 years they could cash that in and get $4, which was a significant actually amount of money if you ever put that into an inflation calculator. Um, Pretty significant. So that helped incentivize savings. So people didn't spend that money. They put it into a bond. It had to sit there for 10 years. They had to wait for it to mature. So the government was balancing the economy. They were trying to make sure they were taking money out through spending. They were controlling the prices via rationing of common everyday goods. And then they used the bonds to incentivize savings so that people were taking the money that they were making during the war, because people were making a bit of money because there's so much being spent into the economy. They're making quite a bit of money, and they sort of said, let's get the public out of a sense of patriotism to save their money. And so that when they came out with savings. So you look at the greatest generation, they came out of the war with savings. They came out with money, like my grandparents, for a down payment on a home. Now you look at kids today, and they're coming out of college with debt. So if anybody's wondering if we have problems in our economy, yeah, we have some pretty big problems since we're saddling our young people with debt. And in the past, prior to probably the biggest, most widespread prosperity we've ever known, people came out of the war with savings. Does that make
So,
sense?
yeah, oh gosh, it totally makes sense. So what would be a good way to help resolve, I guess, this problem that we're seeing, or we're probably inevitably going to have to face when it comes to student loan debt?
Well, one of the biggest things that came out recently was Stephanie Kelton and a few other people wrote a paper, and in it, they are advocating for the government to forgive all student loans and to pay off. And so most of the student loans are held by the government, which is kind of silly. So the government's making interest, we pay interest on their loans. So the currency issuer, the federal government, the currency issuer, is making money off of those loans. It issues the currency. It doesn't need to make money off of us. So it's actually quite strange that is part of the whole deal, that they're actually making money off of our loans, and it's causing a lot of problems in the economy. So they're advocating, forgive the debt, have the government forgive the debt, and any of the loan debt that is actually held by private lenders to pay that off. And also, so the great majority could just be written off the books by the federal government, and then the government could pay the rest of it off from the private lenders that hold those loans. And what would that do for the economy if all of a sudden everybody's student loan was forgiven? People could take the money that they would typically spend on their loan, and they could spend it. They could save it. They could then buy a home with it if they save it and create like enough for a down payment. So that money could be used very differently rather than constantly going back to, for instance, the federal government that doesn't need it. The federal government doesn't need that money. It doesn't need the interest that is made off of those loans. And it's almost an absolutely futile practice that we have. The federal government is holding these loans and making a profit off of it, because currency issuer doesn't need its own issue. It doesn't need its own currency back.
We just spoke with Kathleen Tramley on M&T Modern Monetary Theory. If you like what you saw, please make sure that you subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. And also don't forget to support us on Patreon so that we can continue bringing you more segments such as these. Thank you. Bye.